Hello and good morning, and welcome to week 7 of Star Trek Sundays, now in the Star Trek Sundays Club. Today we're going to be discussing the right to life and death. This is a pretty heavy topic, I know, and we plan to discuss it with the same respect and consideration as the writers of Star Trek have done over the decades. I'm Victoria, and with me is my co-host T. At the top of the room, we've pinned the Star Trek Sundays website, StarTrekSundays.com. There you'll find my captain's log, which is a brief summary of the topics discussed by the group each week, as well as our upcoming missions, which include future topics and the episodes covering the specific themes, including today's, if you want to follow along. Thank you, T, for curating a collection of episodes for us all to revisit. We do have these episodes scheduled all the way till December 11th, which will be the end of our first season. I did really enjoy this week's homework, although it was really heavy. And we've got a variety of questions for T and everyone. So for now, I'll turn the mic over to T.
Thank you so much, Victoria. The topic of the right to life and death. This is not a comfortable topic for me, but one I've learned to face head on with bravery. Death is obviously inevitable, and it hurts like hell, and it sucks. It's just one of those things that we always seem to have too much of in our lives, and the more we go on, the more we seem to accumulate it. Which is why I'm happy to celebrate life. And I see this as the closest I get to having sort of my atheist church. So I think it's appropriate to talk earnestly about the right to life and death and the choices that get made along the way. Star Trek was, as always the case, well ahead of the discussion on this topic, and I've hoped that I've curated some good episodes to highlight their genius regarding the matter.
Absolutely. Yeah, these were just, these are really great episodes. Thank you. This is Star Trek Sundays Club on Clubhouse, and we're discussing the right to life and death. And I'll be bringing people up to the stage to share your thoughts in a few minutes. T, let's start with Et in Arcadia Ego, Part 2. Can you provide a summary of the episode to remind those who didn't get a chance to review it, what it was about? And then I'll ask some questions for you.
Definitely. Et en Arcadia Ego Part 2 was from Picard Season 1, Episode 10, first aired on the 26th of March in 2020, so not that long ago. Et en Arcadia Ego, for those who don't speak Latin, means literally, when in Arcadia, there I am. So literally, there in Arcadia, in our Arcadia Ego, there in Arcadia, I. Now, the I is generally referred to mean death, and so the literal translation might be something like, "Even in idyllic Arcadia, there you will find death." So, in this episode, Picard and his team are pitted against the Romulans and the synthetics of the Coplius in the final of Copolis in the final confrontation. Now, I chose this episode because at the end, Data asks his captain to gift him death in a scene which absolutely had me busted up good. Picard dies because of a brain anomaly, and his consciousness is downloaded into a quantum simulation where Commander Data has been reconstructed from a single surviving neuron. Data asks Picard to kill him when he leaves because he recognizes that his life has already ended well, and Picard obliges.
Thank you for that. Yeah, this was deep. I mean, I have some nostalgia for these characters, of course, and there was a lot of love and respect shown in this episode as well as the others, and I find it quite touching. I find that the more we dig into these things, the more touching um, these shows are, and the more I seem to get from them. It's bringing out something in me. Um, Now, Data says he wished not to die, but to live, knowing that his life was finite. It was sort of a little bit of a mind fuck there, but I get what he was saying. Um, would you choose your own death date if given the chance, or would you rather it be a surprise? I know, a heavy question, but
It is a heavy question, and I definitely was a little bit confused when I think the first time I heard him say that, you know, life, knowing that life is finite. Well, he always knew that, but I later came to understand that he was referring to the fact that his own life had been finite, that it had already ended, and it had ended well in sacrificing himself to Captain Picard. Yeah, I would definitely choose to end my life with dignity and respect, and at a time when I choose, as opposed to, being trapped in endless suffering, or in a situation where I'm no longer capable of enjoying life, or, um, at a point where, I've simply lived enough. I'm definitely not at that point yet. And, I am keenly aware of the need to think about such things and plan such things, and it is something that I hope to do. I hope to plan to die in exactly the way that I plan to live, because I choose to live, as opposed to um, dying. And when I die, I hope I choose to die, as opposed to having it forced upon me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. For me, I think so too. I think having that right, um, as we've talked about, and when I've talked about this with other people, um, it's been commented that we don't really live freely if we don't have the choice to end that living. I think that's an interesting perspective. And speaking of living, we did say the right to life and death, and and I did wonder what was the right to life. Like, is there a right? Like in this episode, there were, and I think we've discussed that we might have to look at this a bit deeper in another episode. Of Star Trek Sundays, the right to live or the right to life, because nobody chooses to have life, but we do choose to live, and so how does that present itself in our society? And you know, I, my first thought was the right to food and shelter, um, and then that just gets into a whole bunch of society's issues. Did you want to comment on that briefly now, and then I'll start inviting people up.
Yeah, sort of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So where do we draw the line about what is necessary, and what is what is gratuitous, or unnecessary, right? I think that it is important that we talk about those types of things as part of this, because those rights that we are being afforded are the same rights um, that they're one and the same. Either we are afforded a right or we are not, right? So, for example, some people aren't afforded the right to live. Um, we call this capital punishment. And then there's other situations in which, other people are not necessarily afforded the right to die, because they're in a coma and on life support, and it's not a choice that they can actually make. And so these are important things that we sort of talk about, like where those rights actually come in. And I think it's important that ultimately, as a society, we establish as many rights to live, and try and traverse as far down that Maslow's hierarchy of needs as we possibly can, with ensuring that people have access to food and water, have access to shelter, have access to, you know, uh, education and other things like that, healthcare, and keep on moving on down that hierarchy and keep on going. Okay, now they have, access to happiness, right? If we can move all the way down to that lowest level, right, the better that we could, right? I don't know what that would look like, but I think as a society, if we don't, sort of shoot for the stars, we'll never end up on the moon.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I do. I do think that there are certain things that need to be rights. That living isn't these things if it's always a struggle. Um, but but thank you, Steve, for coming to the stage. And I'd like to put the questions to you. So perhaps we can start with um, the choosing your own death date. If given the chance, would you choose your own death date, or would you rather it be a surprise?
If we're I think it's more interesting to me if we incorporate like there are there is this like this likelihood ever moving forward into the future, even if just statistically by accident, that I'm gonna die of some random silly meaningless event in the future. And that that I can say, when given a circumstance where it's meaningful to me to put myself on the line, at the very least at risk, at higher risk because of the outcome that I'm aiming for it, then yeah, that's much more meaningful to me and much more appreciated in in how I would go about dying, right? That I actually die because I took a risk that was worth taking, or because I gave a sacrifice of myself that I thought was worth sacrificing.
And I just wanted to remind Steve really quick that we're not in the Kobayashi Maru episode, so no hacking the simulation to give yourself infinite time,
Yes,
please.
exactly. Totally gonna hack that one. Um,
Well, I do like what you've put out there, though, because it will lead into the third episode that we covered. But I'm just going to put it out now so that I don't forget it. I don't want to go into it yet. But if we knew that we only had so long, would that increase our willingness to then sacrifice closer to that date? I think for me it would, but we can maybe go into that a little bit when we get into half a life. So thank you for that, Steve. Christy, welcome to the stage. Thank you for coming again. And I put it to you. Would you rather it be a surprise, or would you rather be able to pick the date of your own death?
Well, yeah, I think that I don't like the fact that it's like those two choices. Like I agree with Steve, like sort of hacking the system, so to speak, because it seems like, I mean, I would want to, as everybody has said, I would want to choose the manner of my death, or like I would like it to have meaning or something like that. Like I would want that choice. Um, I don't know. I mean, obviously, sort of in our world now, we often don't get to choose at some to some extent, but sometimes we are able to choose more than other times. I don't know. It's an interesting thought. Um, and I'm, as you know, I've told you before, I'm ADHD, so like answering that second question was a lot easier because it was the thing you just asked. And I agreed with you, Victoria. um but I guess if I had to pick, like, if I had to pick one, I would probably say that I would like to know the time of my death. So that would be like if I absolutely had to pick something, um, I would like to know when it was going to be. And then I could make plans and make things work the way that I want them to, before I die. So that would be that particular choice. I'm going to yield the mic. Thanks.
Sure, and I get the difficulty with the question. Certainly, when I put out these questions, it's just to prompt conversation, and they're not completely rigid questions at all. Um, and certainly when we say it's either a surprise or a date, but there's no other choices, it's clear that those who feel that we have the right to choose the timing of it would also feel like we had the right to choose how this happened. And wanting to have meaning is great too. And I think as we get further along in the show today, other things will come to the surface, And as always, we'll end the show at 11:30, but we'll continue to have conversation after that if there's a want for that. So maybe T, uh, unless there's something more you want to say about this episode, maybe we can move along to Death Wish.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, good.
I just wanted to point out that with regards to some of these characters, there was a lot of emotional attachment that went into this episode, and I came out of this episode, feeling emotionally drained because uh, it was this big just blow up for me, and I just 10 minutes of just tears streaming down my eyes, down my cheeks about Picard dying and then Data dying and the way that they interacted. I did just want to give reverence to um, the way Data addressed him as captain. He wasn't a captain. He
Yes.
was, an admiral or whatever it was, but that didn't matter. He was captain to Data. He was Data's captain, and the way that Picard called him Commander back, that 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 really felt like the characters were real for me, because these were characters who I had seen go through so much in the Next Generation, and to see them end in this way was hard. It was challenging, and so I hope that we can have, like, just an appreciation for how much thinking went into um, these characters, and then the sacrifice that the actor of Brent Spiner actually made to bring us that brilliant character, only to have him want to kill it off and never have it come back again, because it was so physically challenging for him to wear that makeup, um, that he never wanted to do it again. And they found new roles for him in future episodes and made it great. Continued to bring back Brent Spiner in his role as a Soon, but that that was the moment where Data died, and so a moment of silence for that character. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I was really, really moved by that scene and how it was handled. I did suspect that the actors playing it also felt it, because these characters are so real for them. And certainly, as I said earlier, I think that these issues, but also the storylines that they have, are handled with a lot of respect, and I did appreciate that. So thank you for giving space for that. Um, I let's move on. We can move back to that and talk about some of those other topics in that episode a little later, when we talk about the bigger umbrella uh, topic. But if you could, I'll just reset. This is Star Trek Sundays on Clubhouse. And we're here every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. PST. And today we're talking about the right to life and death. And T, if you could give us a summary of Death Wish, that would be great.
Definitely. Death Wish was from Voyager, Season 2, Episode 18, first aired on the 19th of February on 1996. So in this episode, Captain Janeway puts Q on trial for Q's right to commit suicide. Of course, when Q first encounters Picard, Q puts Picard on trial. When Janeway first encounters Q, Janeway puts Q on trial. I chose this episode because Q has to petition Janeway, a lower form of life by all available measurements, to arbitrate the dispute and final decision of whether or not the Q will be able to commit suicide. He eventually does get his wish, consuming a rare form of hemlock, which is the same way Socrates died when for corrupting youthful minds and not believing in the gods of the state when he was sentenced to be murdered by consuming hemlock.
Yeah, that was a fantastic connection, right? I love it when you can see that the writers of these shows know their history as well. I didn't catch that the first time. I recognized it as a poison, but putting the links together of the philosopher wasn't immediate for me. So Q at one point says, you cannot imagine the chaos that would be created if individuals like Q here could choose between life and death. This is a matter of social order versus anarchy. Was he right, or is the right to death as important as the right to life?
He's partially correct. I mean, there's some aspect to this. Mental health is a important topic. People who do have mental health issues do need help. People who are, troubled, who need, are challenged and thinking about suicide because they think it's their only way out. They really do need genuine care by professionals, for care that I'm certainly not, capable of offering. This is where you need a professional. Um, And so there is an aspect to this of social order where if we don't have that, then these people who genuinely are mentally troubled in one way or another, whatever that way is, don't have the help that they need and are in our society without that help. So that is a problem. But when it comes to the right for somebody who's not in that mentally troubled situation, to commit suicide if they choose to for the reason that they choose to, whatever that may be, that's a different issue. That's not necessarily a social justice issue. And that was what I think Tuvok was trying to argue for, was that he was of sound mind, that he was making an informed decision for himself. And so it's not okay to just blanket paint that issue that way. Not all people who are troubled want to commit suicide. Not all people who want to commit suicide are mentally troubled in a way that requires intervention. Sometimes we do have to protect the rights of the individual, and sometimes we do have to protect the individual over their rights.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to make a comment, but I want to welcome Jamesy and Ruba to the stage, and I'll ask you guys to comment in a second. Um, the, in these episodes, I was reminded of my grandmother who I lived with. I moved in with her when she was 78, and she lived to be 89, but I lived with her for 8 years before she went into a hospital after she had a stroke and couldn't walk. And I remember when she was in her 80s, she said she was tired. And I had asked her, like, isn't it great to live so long? And she basically said no. She was tired. And it wasn't so much that she was physically tired, this was before her stroke, but that all her friends had died. Well, and while she loved her family, it wasn't the same as friends. And I kind of understood that because I would be in our living room. We had a very tiny house, and she'd be in the kitchen with some friends, and they would be talking back about like the 30s and 40s and streetcars and stuff. And she couldn't really talk to anybody who was a peer at this point. And so I felt a sadness for her. I don't know whether she would have chosen to die by suicide at that time. I feel that she felt like she had to live for me and take care of me a little bit, which she did, and lots of my family, um, were grateful that I moved in and was needy because they got her a bit longer. But she lived a few more years after that. But at times it seemed like she endured those years rather than lived them. And so I was reminded about that, and it made me just think about what you just said. Some people would say that if somebody wanted to die, they would have to be depressed or they would have to have something. But I just wonder if somebody is just satisfied. And when I brought this up with my husband yesterday, he said that perhaps being satisfied is a form of being mentally unstable. So there's lots to consider here. Um, I'll just put these questions. They're all relatively similar, but I'll put the questions to James E first. Welcome to the stage, Jay Ra. I'm just going to mute you, and then we'll let James E answer the questions that have already been put to the stage. If given a chance, would you rather choose your death date, or would you rather it be a surprise? And is the right to death as important as the right to life? James E, what are your thoughts on this? I can't hear Jamesy. T, can you hear Jamesy?
I cannot hear Jamesy.
Okay. Oh, Jamesy left.
Hopefully
Okay.
he'll be right back.
J Yeah, hopefully. Oh, there he is. Jamesy, is it working now? Now you're muted.
Morning.
Oh, good
Good
morning. There
morning.
you are.
Okay. So I feel like I would really want to flesh out that first question, but like giving in to myself, I'm kind of an addict when it comes to knowing things. I'm a perpetual learner, so the idea of being offered knowledge and not taking it, it seems like pretty unassailable to me. But to the second question, I think the right to die should be like a fundamental human right. Um, does that mean that you should also like sit down with a counselor before committing to that decision? Like, yeah, that seems like really solid advice. But we gave pilots and astronauts cyanide tablets and pistols like for a reason. Like sometimes we just don't want people to have to hold on to their suffering longer than they need to.
Well, that's interesting. So that's a really good point. So we give these professionals these tablets, trusting that they will know when to take it, that they get to choose without having to consult with anybody. Um, so that's an interesting development in this, because as you just said, you hope that somebody would talk to somebody, and that perhaps everything that could be done for somebody. But if I guess maybe there isn't anybody to talk to if you're on a if you're an astronaut. Um, what do you think about that?
Is that directed back at me? I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah.
sure I
I'm just
understood the
because
question.
you brought up the pilot. Sorry for being, but it just so you had said just a minute ago that that the people should have the right to die, to choose their own death, and that they could receive some counseling, and yet we give some of these professionals these cyanide tablets, and they can make a decision at whatever time they want. Um, so I suspect that's because they've had all the counseling that they could get before they're given the cyanide tablet or something. But I'm just wondering, um, if we think that that's a smart thing to do, um, shouldn't we all have access to cyanide tablets? I mean, that's one of the issues that came up for me, is that right now it's a struggle for somebody, even when they're in hospital, um, to have the right to die the way they want to die. And I'll get into that a little bit later, some of my own experience. But it's like to me, I thought, well, it would be impossible for me to sort of cleanly or tidily kill myself. I don't have access to cyanide tablets. I don't have access to anything. I'd have to be creative, and that can cause trauma for other people if I wanted to do that, rather than going to my doctor and saying, "Hey, can I have a cyanide tablet?" So I
Yeah.
know that
So
you work in mental health, so I figured, I
right.
was really happy when I saw you come up to the stage. I figured you might have a bit more insight on this.
Right. So like the tangent that I can apply to this is with my background working in addiction. to me, this kind of comes down to autonomy. Does the person possess autonomy? And an addict, somebody who's actively engaged in addiction, has essentially lost their autonomy. They're no longer capable of their own autonomous thought. It's been taken from them. Whether or not they want to achieve permanent sobriety is a separate issue. Like what we're trying to get them back to is a place where they get to actually make these decisions for themselves. So, like the question of should we give everybody enough, uh, you know, fentanyl to be able to commit suicide if they find themselves in a situation where they just can't go on living, I think you're making like a huge judgment. One would be making a huge judgment about the mental health of that society to impose that even as an option.
Right. Yes. Thank you for that. I wasn't proposing it necessarily, but I wanted to know what you thought about it. And I guess maybe because I um, always want to have choices about my body, I think, well, this is unfair. I should be able to have this. T, what do you have to say?
Well, I think in this episode, there's one of these really interesting philosophical discussions because Quinn, we sort of colloquially know the Q continuum as Q, but we're referring to the Picard, the TNG Q as Q, and the new Q as Quinn. Quinn was considered a philosopher, a great philosopher of the Q continuum, and what he was proposing in the scene where he brought Janeway and Tuvok and the rest of them into the continuum was that immortality is the disease. It is the thing from which they cannot escape. And I think that the point that he was trying to make was that, in a situation where you no longer wish to have life, being trapped in it is a punishment. And that's why he was seeking asylum. He was seeking asylum not, you know, metaphorically from Q, but realistically for his own right to just go ahead and stop living because he no longer wished to live. And so I think that there was a real parallel being made there, right, of somebody who's trapped and unable to make that decision, um, with regards to their own life and ending it, with regards to Quinn, who was literally trapped in his. And the parallel that the writers wanted to call attention to, that I spoke of earlier, is that was the scene where he said, you know this is why they locked me away, for spreading these dangerous ideas, that maybe it's okay to challenge the status quo. It's okay to challenge this idea that living is what we must do, right? um, and the same, that's what Socrates was killed for, was spreading dangerous ideas. And with the hemlock, and in Socrates' case it was a common hemlock. In Quinn's case it was a rare form of hemlock. But I think that the parallel there is undeniable, and should be called attention to. Is life a prison? Is that true? Is that something that we're trapped in? Is that something that we should seek to escape from? And I see Steve unmiking, so I'll hand it to Steve.
Yeah, so I have I've noticed that when it comes to this topic, the reasoning that's given for why the individual wants to die, the argument, I tend to have like either a completely like benign, like, okay, cool, I get it, go for it, kind of have a visceral response internally, um, when I don't find it to be reasonable. So I'm just gonna do my best to avoid any perception of arguing from emotion on this topic. But so like I notice with, well, when it comes to like the reason that that Data gave, right? Um, it reminded me, like his situation reminded me of Dixie Flatline, which if any of you have read Neuromancer, um,
Yeah.
Yeah,
I love that you said Dixie Flatline right now.
exactly. Right. It made me think of Dixie Flatline, and that Dixie Flatline situation. Just to clarify, he was a construct. So every time he was brought back online, he had no memory of the last time he was brought back online, and he was just being used as a tool to help his former student in hacking, essentially hacking through security, um, get through more security. And so, but at this point, like he was known as Dixie Flatline because he always had a way to back himself up if he died in the process of trying to break through some really tough cybersecurity. So he gets to a point where he goes, "Listen, the next time you turn me off, could you just keep me off and don't turn me back on again?" And I found that profound, especially with the fact that, like, this is an individual who's not even gaining new memories every time they're turned back on. They just rationally reason that, like, this is the situation that they don't want to be living the rest of eternity in, even if they don't have to really remember every bit of it. So I felt like that there had to be something very significant there. I'd parse out the argument further, if there was a Dixie Flatline to have this conversation with, to really find out more about it. Um, but otherwise, I'm just like, I have no visceral response. I have no, like, objection whatsoever. But with Data, he goes and says, I want to live knowing that it's going to end, like, as if that helps him to live. And that I do have a very, like, objectionable reaction to. And I just, for me, I think the best rational response I can give is, well, hey, look at me, right? Look at me. I don't expect to die. I don't want to die. I could go on forever, and I am excited about life. So you're you're definitely not the only option of what could be, to say that you're only excited by the fact that you're going to die. um, and then sorry, one more interesting thought to put on the table is, if we do this carte blanche, like, anyone with the slightest whim who wants to die would just have the ability to die freely, have the cyanide capsule ready to go, um, then over time that would create a naturally selective process in which we would be right back to the beginning, where we have a lot of people who start objecting to the idea of suicide because they're the kind of people that stuck around because they don't choose to commit suicide. Anyway, go ahead, T.
So I would definitely push back against your interpretation of Data's reasoning there, and what it is that Data actually said, because that was definitely my interpretation the first time I watched it, and upon rewatching it, I gained a better understanding of what he was actually saying. It wasn't that he was saying, I want to live, I want to live knowing that my life is infinite. He said, I want to die knowing that my life had been, or not sorry, finite, not infinite, but finite. He said, I wanted to die knowing that my life had been finite. Had Data wanted, had Data been able to live, Data would have chosen to live. Data would have chosen to live in perpetuity. He would have gone on forever if given the option, and I think that he would argue strongly for that. He died sacrificing himself for Picard in order to give his life so that Picard might continue. And he did that. He did that knowingly, and he wanted to die knowing he had done that, that his life had been finite, that it was over, right? He wanted to die knowing he had done the right thing. Does
So
that make
knowing
sense?
that it was a real
Yeah,
sacrifice,
exactly.
is that
Yeah,
what you mean?
that his life had been finite, not that it, not that it would be finite. You know what I'm saying?
I
Right?
think so. I think so.
He wanted to die knowing how he died. You know what I'm saying? Right? That's what he was saying, right?
Yeah.
So I want to welcome the director to the stage. Always nice to have you, the director. Um, uh, this is Star Trek Sundays on Clubhouse, and our regular show is Sunday at 10 a.m. PST. To be notified of future shows, please join the club by clicking the little house at the top of the room. And today we're discussing the right to life and death. And we've discussed the first 2 episodes that we watched and have asked some questions about would you like to choose the date of when you get to die, or would you want it to be a surprise? And do we have as much a right to death as we do to life? I'd like to put those to the director, and I want to add something to the stage for contemplation. If we have the right to die, as we've been talking, and if we feel like or we think that we're not free in our life if we are forced to live it, then what of people in prison who are not on death row, but are forced to live in prison maybe the rest of their lives, but maybe 30 years? I know this is a bit of a wrench. I hadn't thought about it when I was writing my show notes, but I wonder if anybody has any thoughts on whether those people who were put in prison should have the right to die. So, T, what do you think about the prison scenario I've just thrown at you?
Well, I think the prison scenario is analogous to a lot of other scenarios, right? And I think when we're talking about like life in prison, for example, that might not be a life that I would choose for myself. And faced with the scenario of, life in prison or death, I might choose death. Now, I know a lot of, death row inmates don't make that choice. They make the choice the other way. They choose to endlessly appeal and keep their life. And that's, I think, an option that they should have to them, personally, but that's this whole separate question, right? Um, I think that there should be, like, in those types of scenarios, I'm not sure that life imprisonment is really a good scenario, right? But I'm also not sure that uh, corporal punishment is equally a good scenario. I think that the right thing to do is prison reform in that situation, and rather than, like, offering our prison inmates suicide pills as like some form of solution here, I think we should rethink why it is we're locking them up, and and what it is we can do better about that.
Yeah, and I'll just toss it to you as another topic, maybe for season 2 of the podcast. I keep adding these topics, but perhaps we can talk about prison and prison reform. I'm sure that Star Trek covered that at some point. So, getting back to the first 2 questions, the director, um, what what are your thoughts on the right to life and the right to death?
Well, I mean, two. Well, first, should always be guaranteed, because to not try and offer that means that you have decided that one life has no value, which, in the case of corporal punishment, that's where that applies. Uh, the right to death is a stickier one. I mean, if I am suffering or if I am choosing to exit my existence, I think that is a valid choice, one that has to be heavily considered, and only after the consequences of removing yourself from life have been fully considered. Um, it is not my place to tell someone that they must live if they feel that are in hell, alive and in hell. But it is also would never be. That's the one sin as an atheist I could think of is choosing to end yourself before the journey is complete. But choosing how you die is a different question entirely. Do you die in the service of something greater? Then it gives a death a meaning that a life might have been missing. I don't know. It's always a difficult conundrum. But in your case of the prisoners, the reason why that they are sentenced to life in prison is we are intentionally demanding that they serve a level of misery, and it's also preserving their life in case in the case that their case has been found to be false. So life in prison is both more cruel and more humane because it allows for a reversal of something. Once you put someone on resurrecting them, is more difficult. And that's basically where I come down on it from an internal perspective. Um, but I don't know. It's always a complicated thing to decide when do you end the story. And I personally would rather live 1,000 lifetimes and have memory of it all than to um, end myself. But if I was trapped and couldn't communicate and all I could do is live my own mind, ooh, I don't know. I don't know. And hopefully, I never have to make that choice. Hopefully, my death is a surprise to me.
Oh, okay. Yeah. A surprise. I mean, in some way, I've often thought that maybe just living a grand old life and feeling some form of satisfaction at a very old age and just dying in my sleep would be the best without having to make the choice. Although making the choice increasingly seems to be more attractive. But I think what you said almost makes the case for, like what you said about the prison system, that we put people in prison and we make them live as punishment. Living in that life is punishment, and yet there are many situations for people who are not in prison that might be worse than prison, that might feel worse than prison. Um, really, really, very, very poor people who are struggling or abused or whatever might be worse than prison, although they might feel free at least. But I mean, as some of the philosophers said, it doesn't matter where your body is, as long as you're free in your mind, right? But I think the prisoner thing almost makes the case for saying that a free person shouldn't be forced to live if we're forcing the people in prison to live. Does anybody else want to say anything about the prison situation that I just threw out to everybody before we move on to half a life? Okay. Well, moving on, the third episode we watched was Half a Life. T, can you give us a summary of this one? Because I think this one has a lot more nuance to it, and I just really enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to talking to everybody about this. So, please.
Definitely, yeah. Half a Life, The Next Generation, Season 4, Episode 22, first aired on the 6th of May, 1991. So, in this episode, Waxana Troy causes trouble when she finds out that a scientist she has fallen in love with is due to commit ritual suicide. I chose this episode because Waxana Troy genuinely struggles with letting go of someone, but in the end learns to accept his decision and support the man she cares about.
Yeah, it was a simple episode that had a lot of dialogue, a lot of feelings being shared and contemplation. So I really liked that. I mean, the reason he was on the Enterprise was I think he was trying to revitalize his planet's sun, and that was sort of secondary, just to get him on the ship, it would seem. Um, so she fought with him, really intensely fought with him to try to convince him to try to live and to be a rebel, fight back against his society, which he ended up doing at some point, and then changed his mind. And then she comes to support his choice to go ahead with this societal ritual death at 60. This was the thing, is he was turning 60 in a few days. Could you do the same for someone you cared about?
It's a rough one. I want to believe I'm the bigger person. I want to believe that I could. I want to believe that I could be that strong. And I think that, when it came down to it, after I had done a lot of crying and a lot of just, beating myself up, and a lot of probably what ultimately amounted to selfish behaviors, kind of got out of the way, I would like to think that I could be that selfless. But it would really require a lot of convincing. It would not be a decision that I entered into lightly, or with any amount of humor, or any lack of consideration. And it would be one of those really extreme situations. I would have to be aboard the Starship Enterprise and visiting an alien planet and encountering, you know, that type of really out there situation. And I'm sure that anything's possible here on Earth, right? But if I'm ever faced with that type of situation, then I'm not going to be able to face it bravely, as with the brave face that I would like to project outward. And maybe that's part of like having Star Trek Sundays as sort of that therapy session, is you can recognize your own limitation in that regard, and maybe I'll work on that aspect of myself. So
Thank you for that share. Yeah, I, I have been through this with my father's death, and um, what was portrayed in this episode was quite real in this. I think about my stepmother and how she basically begged and begged and begged for my dad to not choose this, to wait to see if we could find out what was going on with him. He had a mystery disease that was never established. And, but like Waxana, on the day, she was a total class, right? We were all very sad, but you don't want to make it any worse for the person. And so I will give her credit, and I will say that she was trying to get him to put off the date. Once it was established and it was decided, she went into this really bravely, and I saw that in Waxana and felt that. So this was quite touching
and what's more
for
is
me.
I really thought that I think that they sort of go out of their way to paint Loxana as being matronly. Troy is the busty young one, where Loxana is the mother, who is elder in age, and just not, and annoying, and all of those things. And when I saw the way that Loxana was looking at at the doctor, I recognized just how beautiful that actress was. And I think I really saw it for the first time, because I always sort of saw her as being, you know, um, you know, not the elder one to Diana's hotness or whatever. But in that moment, I thought that the actor really just, the actress really just shined through as a person. And and I sort of had to look at her skin, and she looked flawless. She didn't look nearly as old as I think they were trying to make her look. And I felt like she sort of got a bum rap in that regard, as a role, when really that actress was quite stunning in every way imaginable. She was an amazing actress, and had looks and talent in the whole 9 yards. And I really felt like um, maybe that was an attempt at redemption for her, to really put her on that pedestal and give her her moment in the spotlight, because she had it. She was amazing in that role.
Yeah, absolutely agree there. I think they do make her out to be, she's written as a very irritating character, right? So that we feel empathy for Picard and Deanna, and certainly that hairdo didn't help her. It did make her look a bit matronly. But at the end, when they're in the transporter room and she shows up, and the actor who played Timothy, my goodness, he can speak with his eyes, man. And he looks really touched. And Loxana says, "It is the custom for your loved ones to join you at this resolution, is it not?" And Dr. Timison says, "You do not have to do this." And she says, "Yes, I do," meaning coming down to support him in his choice. That just, it was a punch in the gut, man. Um, and I think it's because these things touch us, and in our real lives, like we can imagine ourselves in situations like that. And I would hope that my wildness and irritation, like Waxana in regular life, would turn into class and respect like that at a time when someone I loved and who loved me needed it. I just want to welcome Shay and J-Ra back to the stage. We're talking about a half-life, and Waxana eventually comes to support the man she loves in his choice to die in a ritual suicide at 60, when his culture decides to do that. Could you do the same for someone you care about, Shay?
Yeah, if the person was convinced 100%, I don't know the full background of what you're saying, but as a general answer to the question, would I help someone who wanted to die to die? Yeah, I would. If I was like, if I felt like none of it was a burden on myself and it was 100% convincing from the person, that wanted to die. That might sound like a really superficial, unthought answer, but off the top of my head, yes, I have thought about death a lot. I have an illness that makes me think about it almost every day. So I do think about that a lot, and my initial answer would be yes. I hope I answered the question.
Well, absolutely, you did, and welcome. I have seen you before and on Clubhouse, and I really appreciate you coming to the stage, and answering so honestly. Um, and I think that we can have those decisions in our head because we think about them, and then get into the nuance after. So I do appreciate that your honesty there and your vulnerability. Thank you very much. J-Raw, I know you've been in and out of the room this morning. Did you want to answer this question or comment on some of the other things that we've talked about so far?
I think before when I was on stage earlier, I think there was another question that was asked. It was, do you think people have the right to life and death? And I believe they do. If someone wants to go, if you keep him or keep them here, it would be like you're keeping them imprisoned. Basically, that's what I believe. And in this question, would I help my someone that I love do a ritual that ends in their death? Um, I don't know. What does help mean? I don't think I would be the one to take their life. I wouldn't do that. Um, I would be there for them, I guess, but I wouldn't try to stop them from it. I would ask them questions just to know that they're going and it's their decision and it's not something that was they feel like they have to do because of like a religion that they follow or stuff like that. Um, hmm, yeah, I guess that's my answer. Yep.
No, I appreciate that, and certainly the topic isn't. I mean, that would be a deeper topic, and certainly we saw that in the first episode, where Picard had to be the one that unplugged Data, and that's a deeper issue of would we be able to do that for somebody else? Um, I don't know if I could. That's a deeper issue. Being there and supporting somebody in their choice is, you know, as much as it's a hard thing to do, it's way easier than being the person who takes that life for sure. So I totally get where you're coming from. Sean, welcome to the stage. Nice to see you again. So I don't know how long you've been here, Sean, but we've been talking about the three different episodes that are listed in the link tree above that we watched this week, and we're talking about the right to life and the right to death. So I'll ask you, since you're new to the stage, if you have some thoughts, and then we can go back to Steve, Christy, Jamesy, and the director.
Thank you, Victoria. My voice is a little messed up. I'm having an allergy attack here, but I I think that Homo sapiens, as the most evolved species on this planet, um, have built-in desires that are just built into us. You know, we're not necessarily taught these things, but sleeping, eating, sex. But the main thing is to continue life, to stay alive at all costs. You can we have a dog, obviously, and we love him very much, but his whole goal in life is to make sure that he does not starve to death. If we leave the kitchen, he's on the floor looking for anything that may have fallen, and he's just really into eating and surviving. And it's pointed out to me, or it's made me aware of how much the goal is to stay alive. I was recently at our local airport and at the fixed base operator there, and there's cats that wander around sometimes at the airport, feral cats, I guess. And I was looking at this cat, which didn't look like it was starving to death or anything. But let me land my plane. I'm actually trying to make a point here. But he was like eating an insect or something, and I'm thinking, how do these cats survive here? And this one probably was fed by the business there that fuels the airplanes and everything, because he did not look bad at all. But still, his native instinct is to eat whatever he has to do to survive. So my whole point here is that the will to survive, to stick through treatments for illnesses, to stick through pain, to stick through failures in life and addictions, whatever it may be, is so strong that we must stay alive. And I think that's just how, although there's been 5 cataclysms on Earth, according to scientists, and that 98.5% of all species that were ever on this planet are no longer here, not of their own choosing, but for whatever reasons. And we are the last 1.5%, not humans, but all life that we have right now. But the goal is to survive no matter what. And I'm just saying that we should honor that goal and not take it for granted and not minimize it. However, you know, it depends on the situation. If I'm in extreme pain and someone says there's no hope, we'll just give you morphine or some other drug, then I may say, I think I can't take this. I just want to check out. But I think we should never minimize the idea that humans must stay alive. Animals must stay alive, not just humans, dogs, cats, whatever. We all want to stay alive, reproduce, and even after reproducing, we want to stay alive. And so I'm just saying that we should be very careful before we consider the alternative, if that made any sense at all. Sorry for being so long.
No, it makes a lot of sense, and I know that there are people who feel very differently about these these topics, I guess you know, what you said actually brought up a couple of other questions for me, like, um, and now I'll put it to the room for a few minutes. We'll start wrapping up in about 10 or 15 minutes just for the podcast, and then we can have sort of an open conversation after that. But um, how you were saying that we should respect that we should live, it leads me to, and I know we've had other conversations about this, and we don't have to get into anything too deep or personal if that's too much, but it then means that you or people who think like you do um, are then deciding that there is some level or some measure that can be made on if a person has the right. They don't just have the right to die, but that they have to meet a certain criteria before you think it, or you or people who think the same way think that it's acceptable. And I guess that's where the pushback comes in when we have conversations like this, as to where does that end? That feeling of if humans or animals are have this need to live, then we're only in a a short period of human time where people are allowed, and even now they're put down somewhat, to not have children, to not reproduce. And and there's a lot of people who think that that's not right. Um, but of course, I think most of us here realize that somebody can choose whether or not they're a parent or not. And so, should they be able to choose whether they live or not? Like, what's it to you, right? In some way, if we're going to be sharp about it, and then I also wondered on a totally different track whether there was any correlation between those who don't have children, who haven't reproduced by choice, and those who agree fully that people have the right to die. Because I wondered whether there was this thing in people who have kids that want to reproduce and keep the world going that also made them want to live. So, a few things there. I'll open it up to the stage. I'm just watching to see if anybody wants to mic up. We'll just sort of go a popcorn style. Does anybody have tea? Yeah, please go ahead. Let me know what you think on those.
Well, I'd like to return to for just 1 second to what the example that Steve brought up with Neuromancer and Dixie Flatline, in which a construct, the example was relevant because, let's say we have this long conversation with the construct, and the conversation concludes with, the construct going, hey, Case, and Case goes, yeah, and he goes, when you unplug me this time, don't plug me back in, right? And Case goes, all right. And then Case unplugs him and then plugs him back in, and he has no memory of it. It's interesting because I think that the 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 right that we're speaking of here is informed by inaction a lot of times. Like those right to somebody's life is informed by us not killing them, and that's what we actually mean, right? They have the right to live because we're not sitting here locking them up and putting them in jail or shooting them with a gun. They have the right to die because we're not preventing them from jumping off a bridge or something like that. But the conversation gets more nuanced when we're talking about like access to pills, right? Do we give them do we afford them the right to go get cyanide pills and pop those, right? And I think that the question about sort of like what forms those fundamental rights um, is important here too, because if if rights are not like this they're not really what we think they are. They're not this like idea of some inalienable situation that can't be violated. It's really more of this idea that we have that holds us back from taking certain actions or pushes us towards other actions. And I'm just wondering, like, what everybody thinks about sort of rights in that scope.
Well, there are rights that are given by the government, and then there are rights that we uh, take for ourselves. And we should not confuse the two things. You can always take your own life. Like, there's nothing to stop you except for if you're unsuccessful, um, and now you're being forced to live with the consequences of it. So, just because the government doesn't grant you the right to end your own life does not mean that you can't choose to do it. Some people choose to end their lives because through slow actions, and some people choose to end their life sooner by fast actions. So, there's a difference between rights and existing. Uh, we my goal would be to live no matter what, even if I was paraplegic. If I could live a rich life, then I would continue going. If my mind is gone, I hope you harvest my organs. And that's the standard that I live by, but I cannot say that for everybody that's involved. I once had someone threaten to commit suicide if I wasn't with them. And I said, well, that would be a horrible shame and a silly reason to end it. But if you do, understand that I'll know that you've hated me and that I will never think of you for anything positive again. So that way they understood that there was nothing to gain by threatening me with their own death, but that I didn't wish it. So that's about the most personal experience I want to share here. But yeah, we can always opt out of life. But once we opt out, it's really hard to plug ourselves back in.
I
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Sean. You haven't spoken out much, have you?
I wanted to respond to Victoria. My ex-wife and I were married for 20 years, and we had 4 children. Um, to be quite frank, the first 3 were planned. The fourth was sort of an accident, but she was cute, so we kept her. Just kidding. But my desire to stay alive did not diminish after the first, second, third, or fourth child. I think it. People I know that have not had children or choose to not have children or cannot have children and would like to have children, they seem to all want to live, the same amount. So I don't know. Now, as far as a friend that wants to commit suicide for whatever reason, of course, I would talk to this person and try to find out whether they're making a decision that's not based on a drug-induced cloud, where they're not totally aware of what they're doing and why they want to do it and what the possibilities are, and whether or not whatever is afflicting them cannot be eliminated, like an illness or something. So of course I wouldn't want to talk to them about that, and I would expect everyone around them would too. But if if the result was gloomy and there was no hope and they wanted to do this, would I pull the unplug or do the injection? No, I could not do that myself. Would I be there to support them, like in the Star Trek episode? I'd want to see them one last time. Um, so I have not actually. I've been to with people that were close to death, and I have not actually been there when they died. Um, but I don't. I think I would be there for that event to support them in their decision and to see them one last time. But I could definitely not be involved um, at all with it. As far as we all have the ability to commit suicide, of course, regardless of whatever government that we decide to live under or nation we decide to live under, yes. And yeah, and if there is a problem with the suicide, we have to live with the results. I agree with, I think it was Steve that said that. Um, on the other hand, I know my wife knew someone who was had a problem with alcohol and basically drank themselves to death. And many people tried to intervene and stop the course that they saw was going to happen. And it did happen. The person did die. And it was very sad, especially for their mother, who, it took it very hard because everyone could see what was going to happen. And I think in a situation like that, we should definitely try to support the person by doing whatever we can to intervene, because that's a completely different situation than some of the other situations that we've discussed today. So again, we not only do we want to survive, but we also want to help our fellow people, humans, survive too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Today, we've been discussing the right to life and death, which is really interesting. And I'm sure that this topic will come up in future episodes. And T, I would just invite you now to tell us what's coming up in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, definitely. First of all, great discussion so far. Really excited for it. Thank you so much. Um, Coming up, if I could just pull up the website, I've got actually a LinkedIn Linktree app for this. The next time we are meeting is on the 25th of this month, September. We are doing the calculus of war, starting with a taste of Armageddon. And this is actually one of my favorite episodes from the original series, in which the Enterprise beams down and faces a simulation of war. Uh, a, a, um, a society that's doing simulations of war as a solution to actually doing war, and then they get caught up in um, the simulation and are sort of terminated for death, as it were. Followed by yesterday's Enterprise, which is the next generation, in which the Enterprise travels 22 years into the future, and history is inevitably changed, and Tasha Yar is still alive. So definitely a good one there. Finally, statistical probabilities. That's a Deep Space Nine episode where Bashir helps a group of eccentric fellows, genetically modified humans, try and make a useful contribution to the Federation. Really a fun episode. After that, we're doing the 2nd of October. The Resistance is Futile, an introduction to the Borg, starting with Q Who, the next generation, in which Q flings the Enterprise out into the Delta Quadrant and they encounter the Borg for the first time. Followed by Star Trek, First Contact, the movie, in which they go back and, in which the Data is I'll get it straight here. Jean-Luc Picard was captured and assimilated by the Borg, and now he makes a second attempt at actually killing the Borg. Finally, after that, we have Assimilation, in which is the one in Picard, in um, which the Borg Queen is assimilates. I forget, Agnes, that's her name, and inevitably changes the nature of the Borg. Really a cool episode. After that, on the 9th, we've got Who Are Q, which is our part one of our series in our introduction to Q, starting with Encounter at Farpoint, the first introduction to Q, from Star Trek The Next Generation, followed by Hide and Q, in which Riker gets Q powers, and True Q, in which we've got a Q, a human who realizes that they are actually Q. We've got episodes planned all the way out to December. That's our first season, and I'm super excited about it. And then we do have a second season getting lined up for the second week of January. Super excited about that. So I do hope you will join us again next week, and I'll hand it back to Victoria.
Thank you, T. I just want to let everybody know, as you've seen or heard in this episode, when when an idea comes into my head, I just throw it at T and say, "Okay, T, this is what I want to discuss. This is the topic, and please find some episodes." And he's just brilliant at finding these episodes that bring out a lot of feeling and thought and contemplation, which is exactly what we want to do here. So again, this was Star Trek Sundays on Clubhouse, and This is wrapping up the show on the right to life and death. And if you're listening to this on any of the podcast platforms and you want to hear some of the after discussion, then join us every week on Clubhouse. We'll be here. Hopefully you will be too. And if you have any thoughts on our website or the rooms that we're holding, please message me or T. And you can also get a hold of us through the website as well. So thank you again, and I hope you guys have a great afternoon.